Boy, that guy's a tall guy. He's practically a tripod, isn't he? I tell you, we got some really tall guys in Yugoslavia. Did you ever see the Yugoslav basketball team at the Olympics?
That's so great, though.
I don't know where. Oh, they're all mostly Montenegrins, as you probably know.
Right. So we're going to focus on this.
Should I introduce?
Yeah. Well, tell us what we're doing.
Yeah.
And I just want to make sure you got enough light.
Yeah, we got more than enough. Matter of fact, it's too much.
Okay.
Well,
How about this mind and radionics? That would be
right.
Mind and radionics.
Well, are you going?
Yeah.
Okay, this is an impromptu session with Dr. Andrija Puharich, who's agreed to discuss the principle behind radionics, just for the artists and the general public that is interested in looking at this technology from a point of view of using it creatively. And one of the most difficult aspects of this is convincing people that there's some plausibility to these techniques, since it's completely self-referential. So Andre was just earlier had given me the theory behind how this works, so I'm going to turn it over to him right now, and we're just going to go from there.
Thank you, Duncan. I'm happy to have the opportunity to explain this. Let's see if I can start in the Stone Age of radionics. I've worked for years with people who have an extraordinary ability, which is used by governments, by police, and so on, who, if you give them a piece of material that belonged to somebody, let's say who was a suspect in a murder case, and it can be anything that belongs to a person, a piece of clothing, it can be a pencil, it can be a wristwatch, any object that has tangible, tactile feeling coming out of it. The person who is we'll call this the Stone Age radionics person, never heard of such a machine, which, and I'll show you how it developed. But somewhere in his development, the most famous person I've worked with this is the late Peter Hurkes. And for example, I've worked with him on murder cases, particularly with the Miami police. And there was a fellow who was he was a person who picked up from the airport, and somebody stopped the cab and they shot him in the head and killed the cab driver, and it was known as the Smitty case. There was no evidence as to who the person was. Peter was called in by the chief of detectives because he knew how good he was in terms of working, and Peter touched the bodies of the two people, but that didn't give him enough information. He really wanted to get precise information about the murder, and so they took the bullet out of the cab driver's body, that killed him, and it came out of the gun of the murder. And Peter just handled this object, and what he did was he was stroking his fingers over the object. Now, just to get ahead of the story, the radionics instrument, this particular instrument, was built by famous Delaware from England. And this machine is operated essentially by stroking this plate here and getting what's called a stick. In other words, when your finger sort of glues down, that's when the information comes into your head, if that's the way you're working. Anyway, to make a long story short about Peter, just by touching the bullet, he told the police where this guy was from, the exact neighborhood, got an address in Detroit. Mind you, the murder was in Miami. And then he said the guy, by the time the police found where he lived and got his relatives and so on, he would be off to a bar in New Orleans. And if they went there 3 days from now and went to this address, they would find this guy who's the murderer. Now this is covering a vast spectrum of information. The guy's past, the movement, the motive for the murder, and where he was going next. And it's a recorded piece of history that the guy was found in this bar and was arrested by the police and eventually was disposed of by the process of law. So that's what radionics in the Stone Age sense is. It means that through your fingers, a person who is gifted, who is trained, and a lot of artists have great tactile feeling, particularly plastic artists and sculptors and so on and so on. They get a lot of information. The whole business of stroking the skin of somebody, that's a whole universe in itself, as we know, gives tremendous information. For example, getting back to this fellow Peter, if he shook hands with somebody, it gave him all the information he needed about that person. He could be debriefed for hours going into the place of birth, the parents, the education, all from one contact. And this is an art that's derided. It's not used, it's allocated to gypsies and fortune tellers and on it goes. But it's a latent power that man has, and you can train anybody to do this. They may not all be Peter Hercuses, but they can get information by just getting in the right state of mind and being sensitive to what's happening between their fingers. Now, as time went on, people like Delaware converted this primitive, and Hieronymus and others we can mention, converted this primitive experience of just rubbing, and getting information into a device. Now this device, you don't have to know how it works, but essentially, when you rub this plate, you're on what's called a capacitor, something that builds up charge. Everybody's heard about a capacitor. And then the signal from your finger, a little electrical signal, goes through these resistors, all of whom are in series. And every time you add a little resistance, you change the tuning here, okay? And so this is a kind of a modern version of a fundamental property that man had way back in the Stone Age. Now, anybody who is watching this tape can do a very simple thing. You can, let's say you want to know, or if you have a child, a son, daughter, whatever, and you want to know where they are, they're off at school, you can take a piece of cloth that they wore. It can be socks, it can be a handkerchief, it can be a tie, anything, piece of jewelry, and you go through this process of closing your eyes and sensing what happens in your mind as you do this, okay? You're wiggling your finger. Now, what goes on in this process? Years ago, when I was digging deep into this phenomena, I found out that when you stroke your fingers, that during the stroking, special pulses come out of the skin. Now, at that time, I could measure the pulses, but I did not know the nature of those pulses. I knew the pulses were information, okay? And any kind of information you were seeking. So, I did record this, and I gave some papers years ago for some scientific society about this. And essentially what I told the scientists was the skin is made up of keratin, the horns are made of keratin and so on, and they are all made up of what's called an alpha protein, which means a single strand of protein. DNA is a double helix, which means there are two of these wrapped together in a certain way. So it turns out that when you stroke, it's like stretching that little string. It's microscopic in the skin. And when you do that, a proton is wiggled, and when that proton, everybody knows what a proton is, I don't have to explain that. Hydrogen is one proton, one electron. The proton, when it's stretched, wiggled, its energy is changed. And when that happens, a very unusual thing happens, which we are now able to measure, that proton sends out a signal which, if you looked at it in a special type of camera, it would be like bullets flying out from a machine gun. And each one of those bullets is what we call a scalar wave. A scalar wave simply means, it's very, very simple, that the properties of that wave can be defined by one number only. It's not like an electromagnetic wave, where a magnetic field and electric field and all that stuff. One number, that one number is frequency. And that's what the skin puts out, frequency. And when you tune, as I do here, by stroking, and suddenly you get a stick, that means that you have tuned in on the information bank that you're looking into. Whether it's a person, whether it's an object, whether it's the properties of a medicine, all this kind of stuff. So that's the simple explanation. Behind that, I may say, and I just want to give you assurance, that there is a very profound physics. And I've worked at this physics for 20 years, and the physics says as follows. I will make a little drawing here to see if we can get this picture across. Here is space. I'm just drawing it as a curvature, but it's nothing in it. It's pure space. It's called vacuum in modern physics. In this vacuum, we have found out, I might say something right now, there is no instrument in the world that can measure what I'm just going to show you. Matter of fact, in Texas, a contract has been let out for about $8.3 billion to find this particle that I'm going to show you, and it's called a magnetic monopole. And all it is a field of energy like this, and it has a little more structure than that. And that field is a monopole, which means that it has only one sign. All magnets have plus and minus, north-south pole, right? This has only either a plus, and if you do it the other way, the other direction of spin, this can be plus and this can be minus. We have the two fundamental constituents of the universe, these magnetic monopoles. Now what happens is these pop out of space like this, and I'm going to just make them simple here. This one is plus, and this one is minus. What happens, I want to say something which may shock you, but we did not spend $8 billion to find this. I worked with a lady who is like Peter Herka. She doesn't want her name used. She's a psychic, and she's got one gift. She can see into any fundamental particle. If you want to know what a proton is doing, she gets her head into it and she'll draw it. I have stacks of drawings like that. And then I quiz her, and over 20 years we've developed a common language. So she explains these, for example, in terms of certain colors, and then we learned that that color is a positive or north-seeking magnet. And all of nature, everything is made up of these two fundamental particles. It turns out then that as these leave, you get a situation like this where you get plus, minus, plus, minus. That's magnetic monopoles. Plus, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I made it come out. They'll form into a ring like this. And those 8 particles will then have one more particle added. Now, I'll get to that in a moment. But what happens to these, I don't want to go into all the physics, but visually, imagine there's a compressive force here, and that these squash into closer density packing of these original particles like this, and they come out. Just imagine there's 3 triangles, 1, 2, 3. And those triangles are locked together in a certain configuration, and that then gets a magnetic field around it. There's one in the center, so that's 9 particles, okay? And that's a proton. And a proton, if it doesn't have a 10th particle, there's only 9, it becomes a neutron. Everybody knows what that is, okay? A neutron is 9 magnetic monopoles, and a proton is, this is 9, and this is 9 plus 1. Now here's the magic. Everybody thinks that an electron is something we all know what it's all about, and we don't know a damn thing about it. Because the electron is really a magnetic monopole, okay? And it goes into orbit. I'll make another point here. It goes into orbit around the proton, and in the orbit it becomes exactly like a Tesla AC generator, and it produces a negative charge, even though it starts out as a monopole, and this develops a plus charge, and that's the proton. Simple. Okay. All this is visualized. Someday when I get a little money, I'm going to try to put this all on a computer program and have all this alive the way my colleague sees all this stuff, and I've learned, and I've been able to fortify all this with equations and show how all of modern physics arises from this simple mechanism. And here's the bombshell. The bombshell is that all information in the universe, all intelligence, the origin of life, all the things that we call creation, come out of these little magnetic monopoles, and they in turn, when they're in this configuration, pulse out. I'll have to show this to you separately. Pulse out these little fields, little pulses, and the number of pulses per second gives you the precise information. For example, in the case of a healer, which is another example of what we're doing in radionics, a healer can put his or her hands on somebody, and we can now measure these little scalar fields. And the scalar field has to be extremely precise in frequency. For example, it can't just be 8 pulses per second. It has to be 8.000 if you're going to have 8. And if you want to go 8.123, that'll have a totally different effect. Now this loops all the way back, in the case of healing and information, back to some part of the body that has to be healed. And just like I described the alpha helix being a chain of certain structures, there's certain protons, this thing in there, that either sends out a signal like this or receives a signal. If it receives a signal, it passes it on to DNA, and you get a healing effect. If you send out a signal, you can do a lot of things, and I'll get back to this box here. You can send out information. Let's say you want to do something very unusual, like change a chemical mixture, like a set of paints used in painting, and you can, by your mind, change the color that nobody can reproduce except you, because somehow you found a frequency that you can create the chemical change and so on. So,
could I just interject?
yes, please.
Kandinsky spoke about, at the beginning of modern art, Kandinsky spoke about an inner form, that the abstract artists, in order to justify the assertion that what they were doing was more than just Andrija, was that in referring this back to art, that Kandinsky, at the early, in the spiritual, his treatise on the spiritual in art, and then people were speaking about these problems in metaphysical terminology, constantly referred to the process of locating the internal image that was behind the modern impulse, the impulse that would locate the virtual image that lay behind the surface of reality, bringing that forward into life, bringing it forward into art, and using this justification as the foundation for modern art, separating it from infantile art or primitive art that was just done without recourse to any intellectual direction whatsoever. So with that in mind, what we're looking at is a scientific theory which would, for an artist, begin to give them a handle on what the intuitive process was that led people into the creative process of making art. And what I'm seeking to do through this discussion is bring that intuitive process back outside to the world in a sense of science again, where the methodology of certain techniques and tools like the radionics equipment can be used by artists to illuminate this external object in terms of a function, the way the primitive people, or not the way the native peoples of the world were able to do through ceremony and the pictographic composition, like Navajo sand paintings and that sort of thing. And we find it hard to believe that an image, a static image, an artistic image, can have a functional component that will move energy in the real world the way Newtonian physics describes it. So here, Andre's giving us, who spent, by the way, his entire life researching this. I mean, this is a man who's written, 30 books?
No,
And,
not that many, but
yeah,
hundreds of articles.
hundreds
and
of articles,
patents and all
75
kinds.
medical patents, many lectures throughout the world, and has, after all his experience with this and working with introducing the top psychics to, our country, has really been able to articulate the functionality of this equipment and the methodology, which is accessible to people without recourse to, elaborate and expensive scientific laboratory equipment. So with that, I'm just going to turn it back to
No,
you.
that's a very good point, Duncan, because what you're looking at here, particularly in the case of action, which is healing, and information, which is the box or just wiggling your fingers, you have the form, the creative process in this, and this extends all the way out to universal intelligence. It's packaged in a little brain thing in us, and then, as you go out into the cosmos, these are the formative forces that make everything, number one. Number two, you go back to the inner form of things. I'm sure you've read Plato in your extensive inquiry. That's what he was trying to teach, that in everything physical, there is an inherent form.
Yeah, geometry.
Platonic
Yeah.
ideas. But here we have it in every aspect of life that we know and life we don't know. So the idea was articulated a long time ago as a formal system by Plato, and I've even taken the time to learn Greek in college so I could read Plato in the original and understand what he was trying to say. So the idea is not only ancient in thinking, as with Plato, but in modern art, as you say, and anywhere where people try to create something different, something original, that has a reality. It's just not like tying a brush on a donkey's tail and having them wiggle on the, to put on stuff. But the creative art, and everybody, in the act of any kind of love, whether just meeting of eyes or love with a work of art or an artifact and so on, this creative energy is transferred from person to person. And when it becomes negative and gets widespread, then we have the downfall of civilization. And that's unfortunately a phase we're now with the edge of, like a house of cards, just suddenly collapsing.
Well, on that note, how could this type of information and this type of technology serve to reverse that type of situation were it used properly and in time? Can you say something?
Well, I think you're on that track already, Duncan, some of the work you showed me, but it's what we call mandalas from ancient esoteric knowledge, whether it's a sand painting. If you're sensitive to this kind of thought form, let's use that word for the moment, you can feel the energy coming out of one of these mandalas. The form is important, the color is important, and if you want to activate it, Eastern religions believe that you can have a sound which can be articulated and bring that mandala to life. And I've been in a lot of esoteric situation to have been a student of many of these religions, just to know how and why they work. And sound itself can activate this in other people. Now, in the modern world, we have all kinds of sound. We, you know, loud sound, and we have bang bang, and we have harmonics, and so on and so on. One of the early ways, knowing that these energies exist and you can't get rid of them, they're there and they're permanent, and you can open yourself up to them, and if you know how to receive them, you can give it back to anybody you're in contact with or your environment.
Mm-hmm.
And you can imprint this energy without moving a brush or anything. It's there in the wood, it's in a stone. And this has so many ramifications, but there are records and there are films of Tibetans lifting a stone, something like 200, a big stone, I mean like 6-7 tons, straight up by just chanting and blowing certain horns which have a certain frequency pattern. They're all low frequency pattern, and this thing will sail up and land on a ledge way up high where they're building a temple on an inaccessible area. So you see how this energy can not only affect people and put potency in plants as the homeopaths do in medicines and so on, but you can actually use it in the physical world of construction, big stones, etc.
But more importantly, within humanly, between people, to be aware of what we would call the radionic dynamics of the way energy is transferred and its potential impact, although maybe not momentarily apparent, how this can either spread out in a system that is reflective of the universal standards that were set down by people like Plato, and therefore were moved into society in an orderly way and dispersed throughout the civilized world of that time, bringing coherence and order and beauty into life. In the same fashion, the very same information utilized by whatever means is completely capable of destroying this.
Yeah.
What we need to really find out, at least from the limited vantage point of this discussion is regarding art, is how to best apply this focus, or how to a person can begin to take the initiative and to regain, let's say, the potency to apply this type of theory and this type of instrumentation, or at least even philosophy, to his own work, bringing this forward in a way that, whatever the consequences of the future are, at least leaves the individual with the idea that they have succeeded in discharging a certain amount of good information back into the ecology of the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I think we all recognize intuitively that you've got to start with the children. And there are many different ways of bringing up children in the proper way, and we have modern things like the Steinerian way, and we could go on and on all over the world. Cultures have preserved these qualities, these forms, these energies, which are very hard to detect. We're just beginning to put our fingers on it in our instrument. So if everybody would just, I'm talking about today, would dedicate their attention, like us old fellas, like, we're over the hill and we ain't going to do very much, but kids, they were just indoctrinated gently with love and music. You remember one of the things that Plato said was the three important things in bringing up children to make them real people is music, gymnastics, and what was the third one?
We didn't get
love.
Yeah, I think they called it harmony.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry I forgot that, but it's easily looked up. But if these children can be not only saved from a destructive life, we see it every day on television. I mean, every kid who's going to school dreams of having a gun so he can protect himself and blah, blah. You know, the whole thing is getting to be insanity. So right now you can start, I'm talking about anybody who's seeing or listening to this, whoever is close to you as a child, whether they're, a relative, a cousin, or whatever, if we can direct all our energy there, they may overcome and survive what down
inertial barrier,
stuff,
yeah.
the dead stuff that's going on, and maybe we got a fighting chance of making it.
Well, in my experience with radionics, which is considerably limited compared to yours, where I've had the most success with this, using this type of instrumentation, which by the way can be diagrammatical as
Yes.
well as electronic.
Yeah, it can be symbolic
It can
of
be
this piece
symbolic.
of matter.
Yes.
And if the right thought form goes into making that
Mm-hmm.
a mandala, let's say, a design on a flat surface,
Mm-hmm.
it will breathe out that same energy that we're talking about. And it all has to do with healing, information, and love. That's the carrier.
The carrier wave of the thing.
Because you can misuse this too.
Yes. Well, what I found this very directly helpful for to me was, since I don't have a medical background, I was reluctant to go into any of that side of it. But I found that, for instance, if I felt myself onset with anxiety or experiencing what you might call a block of some kind, that just by using the instrument in this feedback, reciprocal feedback loop that this thing provides to me as a person, when I was able to get this machine tuned to my particular block, I could dissipate the block.
Yeah.
So for me, I viewed it as a form of deconditioning technology, regardless of how you use it in the external
Very
world.
important. Yeah.
You can use it within, and legally, you can use it within on yourself and your family.
And
in
you
order
can use
to
it in
remove
public without
emotional-
anybody knowing that you're
Yeah.
shifting gears.
Yeah, and you can. So if you were producing art, if you were producing work in your studio, doesn't mean you have to be a radionics operator. If you're aware of the principles, if you're
It's
aware
all
of,
here.
you can put this thing right back to work in your own life just by reducing the amount of barriers and the inertia that you experience as resistance to your own life and to the expression of your own life. So I think that, I mean, just to comment on this, maybe you could reflect on that a second in terms of how this actually works. I mean, just a little bit more directly from your scientific experience.
Okay, you have to remember that these knobs are resistors, and they control the frequency that's put out or received, either way, depending on which way you're going. And the actual conductor of this whole operation is the finger. Without the finger, you can't make a decent radionic machine. And that's because here we have the circuit that generates the right frequency based on what you want to put out. If it's healing, we can define that now better and better. We know certain frequencies will work. You're aware, but other people may not be, that I invented a watch that puts out 8.00 hertz scalar field like this, okay, like these pulses. And I have found out from a number of years of research that if a person wears this watch and they have what we call malignant high blood pressure, that means it's so high you're candidate for a blowout somewhere, anytime. I put this watch on the worst cases I could find, and I swear, proven fact, that in 1 week, the blood pressure will come down to normal. But within 3 weeks, what we found is that this little ticking, which is this here, right here, will lower the blood cholesterol, will lower the blood, the high density lipids, and in general, gradually clean out the arteries which have all these atherosclerotic depositions on. That's a little watch. This is the sample of it, putting out these pulses at a, excuse me. Sorry. Let's cut that out. Putting out these tiny little pulses, which almost difficult, impossible for people to measure. And there's some scientists that you and I know tried to measure it and couldn't, but I've developed devices that can measure it. A little mechanical thing operating off a quartz crystal can have this profound effect. And we all know that malignant high blood pressure cannot be dealt with adequately by modern
Mhm.
medicine. So you see the contrast there?
Mm-hmm. I really do.
Yeah.
Do you
So-
think that in viewing that when a person goes to paint, use a pencil or use a brush, and they're constructing something on a canvas or a piece of paper, that there's a correlation you could draw between the frequency that comes out of the fingers and obviously what from inside the person is powering that, and what the nature of the design is that is put on the paper, in the sense that when you find an object, an artist will find that he'll do a series of pictures and one will stand out completely dramatically from all the rest. And you could sense that perhaps you put, at that moment, you were linked with something inside yourself, some source,
Absolutely.
that now was able to generate a signal through your fingers that gave you an image, recognizable now on the outside, correlated
And
by
that
the
which
viewer.
you put out, which is
Yeah.
what we're talking about, is there permanently.
Is there permanently.
Yeah, permanently.
So that's a possible
Well-
explanation of why one painting would survive through time and through many cultures and be universally
Yeah.
understood, whereas one painted the day before or the week before, so relatively close to it, would be lost.
There's a whole mystery about this aspect of art that has not been articulated properly, I think, even though Kandinsky and Plato, and we now have scientific tools. We not only can teach people to do this, we can get feedback to show that they are doing it, and we can also measure the long-term effects, whether it's on humans and the art form, and that is transferred to other people. We are on the verge, in my opinion, of breaking through all these stupid barriers that keep us from advancing, and I'm talking about official science and American Medical Association, FDA, and all these turkeys who sit around preventing things from happening.
Right.
But we've got to get over that hump. That's part of the process.
And in that sense, when artists, which have been delegated to a relatively ineffective position socially, I might say, over time, could utilize some of these ideas and some of these technologies to revitalize their work and apply it to some of the inertial walls that exist in these
That
other
can have
areas.
almost immediate impact when you think of the kinetic arts,
Mm-hmm.
the ballet, various forms of dance, even going back to so-called dances of the primitives, where they can, and I've seen this with my own eyes, they can do a little sound and a little movement, not a very big thing, and the rain will start falling,
Mm-hmm.
and parched fields will start reviving, etc. The same thing can happen to the human soul.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who is really in trouble and needs to get out. All these things are possible. But we all know that these official called blocks, with the ties and the stiff shirt and all that stuff, they're just set up here to stop these things from getting out because they're afraid they'll lose control.
Yeah.
You see, what we're saying is that everybody can really be not only the captain of his own soul,
Mm-hmm.
but the integrator, the organizer of people around him in society. If you're a creative artist, you can have a great effect and so on. So this little box is just
It's a metaphor.
it's
Yeah.
a metaphor, really,
Yeah.
but the real thing is in us, and
Mhm.
anybody can bring it out. I know some great teachers, and you know some of them as I do, that can bring this out into people.
Mm-hmm.
But they're all at the periphery of society,
Yeah.
They're not the big money makers, they're not
Right.
the Cadillacs, they're not the gym bakers, and so on and so on. So these things are here, but we're just not making use of it.